Because needless to say, I could easily dispense with the average person talking about their knowledge of African history who makes the same argument. What I'm saying is someone who is telling you, well, then you're negating your being, negating yourself. That's self-hatred. And then I say, well, wait a minute. I don't hate the fact that I'm descendant of the ancient Kemites. I'm not hating the fact that my ancestry is connected to the people within the Moorish Empire or ancient Carthage or the peoples of Mali or the ancient Congo or Angola. I said, where do you want to go? The Nok culture? I mean, come on, right? I know I can tell you about Europeans worshiping Africans. I used to tell my students when I first started teaching, they would make fun of some students who were darker in hue. And I used to tell my students, I wish I was that complexion. And the students look at me going, wait a minute, why would you want to look like this person who's so black, so dark? And I said, because I know who they are, because I know their value. The problem is you don't. And they're looking to me as a young teacher and going, well, wait a minute now, this young teacher, why would he want to affirm that, right? So clearly my aversion was not to saying I'm of African ancestry or that I have an aversion to being dark in complexion. My aversion is to the word black. But there was a long period of time when they couldn't become citizens because of a fear of China's presence. In fact, part of what people talk about the yellow peril, that was a term from those days. The yellow peril was what they said. They were afraid the Chinese were too foreign to be absorbed into U.S. culture, Americana. But what it was straight up racism against this Asian community, the Chinese. But here's the key. Even though the mainstream media was often calling them the yellow peril, they didn't continue to call themselves yellows. So I'm trying to figure out why folks are still, trying to hold on to black. Here's my guess. The people very often who will tell you you're the one, because I've heard the same thing, and they come after me too at times saying based on my complexion too, because make an assumption. And I say, look, I just told you I've dedicated my entire professional life to uncovering and to teaching the legacy of African people, our contributions to the world, right? I was disciplined and dedicated enough to make that my mission. As the French might say, my raison d'être, my reason for being, or d'être, reason for being. But this idea of saying, you're doing that because you're self-hating, I turn it around and say, I think you don't want to call yourself African because you're not comfortable with being of African ancestry. You somehow think black gives you an out. When you're talking about the best of African cultures, respect for the elders, recognizing the interdependence and interconnection of all things, which means you have a greater respect for nature, or nature. It means that you clearly know that I'm important because we are important. The communalistic view versus the individualistic view. The desire to remain in harmony with nature, right? Those are just a few examples of what we would say were part of a traditional African worldview. The extended family versus the nuclear family construct. That's why customarily, how long we've been calling each other brothers and sisters, right? This idea of recognizing, even when I went to visit family back home in Bermuda for the first time when I was a child, everybody calls everybody cousin. They were like, what's up, cousin? And I was like, cousin? right? Some people joke and say, well, it's because the country is so small, everybody is a cousin, because everybody's so related. But the other piece is, it has to do with our particular value system, our axiology, that you are an extension of me. So I'm trying to do what I can to make it in the world, but without causing you much or any harm if possible. And I certainly see your value. I'm not going to devalue you because you look like me. What am I saying about myself? This Japanese man came in, he worked with him in the, for Metropolitan Transit Authority. He used to do carpentry, repairing the trains, the subways. And this man would basically keep to himself. He would just come in and bring his lunch, and he would sit down and eat. And, he might nod or something to people, but he kept to himself. And this continued for some time. And then one day, my uncle, who was a member of the Moorish Science temple, had understanding about the Moorish legacy, was talking to some brothers who worked with him, and laid it out. Sounded, I imagine, probably a lot like I sound in terms of sharing historical information and talking about context and everything else. And when he finished, he said that he sat down to eat, and this Japanese man got up from his table, which was a little further down, came over, bowed. He said, "Now we can talk." Amnesiatic, right? Subjugated or oppressed. This idea of people not knowing, which results in many people who do know, not wanting to associate with us. Because as they say, we don't know how to act. And it's like, look, I don't know what I can trust you with in terms of talking with you. Or I don't know what you're going to do, because you may have no honor, because you don't know who you are. This is telling us even about those connections, right? Brazilian Muslims that people often don't make reference to, which were part of these religious groups that brought different people of African ancestry together. So people practicing traditional, if you will, African spiritual systems. And then you had people who were practicing an African interpretation of Islam that goes back to the marabouts. And in fact, there are names, Maravitinas, Marabillos, which are Native American surnames. How do you get a Native American surname, Marabillos and Maravitinas? These are all derivations of Marabout. Even Moabite, which was a term used also for the people in the 11th and 12th century who were in, where? Al-Andalus. So you have the Spanish Catholics referring to these people as Moabita, who are also known as the Almoravids. Medieval historians have sometimes referred to the Dark Ages as cold, hard, and brutish. And that's referring to when Europe fell into a period of kind of cultural and social decay following the collapse of the Roman Empire, which was a great empire. The Moors, starting in the late 7th, early 8th century of the Common Era, have brought in the best knowledge from the ancient world, things that had existed in ancient Kemet or Egypt. In fact, George James talks about the Moors as the custodians of Egyptian culture and history. And George G.M. James doesn't get enough, I think, credit for his contribution in Stolen Legacy got his doctorate, as I understand, from Columbia University. So this was no slouch. But James said the Moors were the custodians of ancient Egyptian culture. The Moors, the Muslim world interacting, now has connections to China, to India, Nile Valley, Western Sudanic empires of Mali, Ghana, and Songhai, as well as Persia and throughout. And I would even venture to say connections and trade with the Americas. But all that ancient knowledge that Africans and Asians, and even the knowledge that the Greeks had possessed, was something that the Moors, meaning the African or African and Asian Muslim population, had brought together and are spreading throughout Europe, pulling Europe out of its dark ages, setting up institutions of higher learning. Clearly, such folk are going to look very attractive, certainly to the rank and file. The only people who would see those individuals as not being attractive would be those in positions of power. Now you're talking about the conflict with the church, right? The Roman Catholic Church, who would see that, wait a minute, we have to do all we can to try to demonize or negate these people because we're losing our parishioners. One of my mentors, Dr. Asante, who actually brought this out, I think in his book, Kemet, Afrocentricity and Knowledge. But he's the one that said that the conquistadors argued that it was okay to enslave the Indians because they didn't have nationality. It's okay to enslave them because they didn't have nationality. In their minds, they had so objectified these indigenous peoples. They had reclassified them as, like I said, Negros, or even if they use the term Indios or Indians. Some of them, if they made treaties with different groups, then again, a treaty implies I recognize that you have nationhood. But if someone is adhering to the term that I'm using to deny your existence as a person, then you are telling me you're not a person under the law, right? You just told me you're a Negro, you're black. Terms that existed in U.S. law and in much of European law, and specifically the term black for those of British law, for someone who didn't have personhood, right? Or you'd have to qualify it, black person. But if you said blacks, it was understood that a person who you defined as black, or Negroes can't be citizens because Negroes under the law were never meant to be citizens. Negroes are property. And when people tried to make blacks or Negroes into citizens, it caused a constitutional rift, right? Now, this in part relates to the fact that there was a treaty that existed between the U.S. and the Moorish Empire, but it also relates to those who were simply following the law and saying, if you're calling yourself colored, Negro, black, this country requires that for you to be a citizen, you have to be free and a national. So even though this group is now called white, I can ask you, what's your name? O'Reilly. Oh, you're an Irish national. What's your name? Heimbach. Oh, you're a German, and so forth. If you couldn't affirm your nationhood, you were not a protected national. Democratic republics, which is what the country was and presumably still is. During the days of slavery, you would have had citizens, aliens, and slaves. Aliens can become citizens if they're naturalized. Slaves were legally defined as property. So if you're legally defined as a Negro, a Negro can't have the rights of a citizen. At best, they can be given a granted privilege. So when also the late, great John Hope Franklin talked about quasi-free Negroes, quasi-free meant, yeah, you weren't enslaved, you weren't on a plantation, but your rights were essentially non-existent. You were given privileges.